Alright, welcome to Devlog 0, my failures as a part-time solo indie game dev, and how to not make the same mistakes. For those of you who just want a bullet point list, everything is expensive, you will not make a perfect game, make code readable to strangers, you're not as competent as you think, never update Unity, Unreal, or whatever other third-party software you use mid-project. The world doesn't wait. Be aware of the sunk cost fallacy, and maintain a healthy work-life balance. But definitely stick around if you would like elucidation on these points, and for the first public info of my solo dev project, especially if you're a fan of Brigandine. Everything is expensive. While I have spent exactly $0 on my first game, I have been developing it for the better part of 6 years. If you can't pay for something to be done, you have to do it yourself. Any time you spend working on one thing is time that you can't use on anything else. I have not been keeping any sort of log of my exact hours worked, the majority of that time. But my estimate is that the average is around 30 hours per week, every month, for 6 years. That's roughly 120 hours per month, 1,440 hours per year, or 8,640 hours in total. Keep in mind this is a conservative estimate, as I'm a workaholic, and before I started making YouTube videos, I would often work 14-plus hour days whenever I could, in addition to squeezing in 1 to 3 hour blocks whenever able. Fortunately, I have a stable income, so my needs are met for now. But if I ever become a full-time dev, it will be important to be acutely aware of the money and time being invested. You can do the math yourself for if I were being paid minimum wage in your area. Definitely not free, is it? This is not to say that it takes years or tens of thousands of dollars or more to create a game, but there is always a cost. We'll get to my specific situation later, but it is important to understand that every single aspect of game development takes time. If you don't have the money to throw at problems and are doing it all yourself, you have to go into the planning stage with accurate estimates and timeframes of every single aspect of development. Early on, decisions need to be made and priorities set so that the time spent is wasted as little as possible. Time management is paramount as a solo dev, especially part-time. One way to combat the problem is to ensure that you're working on things in the best possible order. I have failed at this countless times, and it always takes a significant time investment to review my work, catch back up on what I was doing, and actually start making forward progress again. Another solution is to have a solid plan written out in as much detail as possible, with as solid of time estimates as possible, and attempting to keep that timetable, even if it means reducing the scope and features of your project. You will not make a perfect game. Even AAA studios don't make perfect games. Sometimes they don't even make good games, or try to release them before they're good. You have to temper your expectations based on realistic assessment of your budget and capabilities. Even then, you're most likely going to fall short of the game you have in mind when you start your project. And that's absolutely fine. While I have never believed I'm capable of making a perfect game, I have fallen into essentially the same trap by fixating on making the best I know I am capable of, without considering the cost of doing so. Maybe I'll share some stories in the future, but there have been many times where I spent far longer than necessary because I insisted on doing the absolute best I was capable of, even when it took 10 times or more longer than good enough TM. I had no idea I was even doing it until I started soliciting opinions from others and realized that details I would focus on are largely missed by people who don't know every line of code and every pixel of art intimately. Even if they would have been noticed, I was informed after pointing things out, it would be acceptable as long as it was good enough TM. Especially considering the game was being made by a solo dev. However, this is not an excuse to asset flip or put out shovelware. Make code readable to strangers. Always comment your code, and use naming conventions and syntax to let things be as easy to understand as possible. Pretend your code is going to be read and worked on by someone who has nothing to do with you and no way to talk to you. I guarantee, by the time you have to go back to your code after spending weeks on learning art, animation, music, or whatever other tasks, you will often feel like it is the first time you're reading it. Sometimes, all it takes is a long shift at your day job, and you'll be completely lost when you sit back down to work. Do yourself a favor and leave some commentary. It can be short and sweet if you also name everything in a very easy to follow way. On one occasion, it took me more than a week to figure out how the systems I was currently working on, and had somehow hacked together, functioned. And I decided the time spent refactoring would save more time in the future than it would cost at the moment. It took several months, but has definitely saved me several more. Being able to skim through and figure out what a class does and how it does it in its entirety should only take a minute. If it takes longer, either your class is doing too much, you didn't comment, your naming conventions aren't informative, your syntax is hard to parse, or some combination thereof. It's worth the time, especially if you have someone else join the team at any point, or if you're like me and, occasionally, are a goldfish. Once more, proper planning and outlining can help immensely here. You're not as competent as you think. I have an art degree with a focus on digital art, 3D modeling, and animation. I had never made art for games. I had never made a map. I estimated that my world map could be completed in a week. I, luckily, made a quick rough draft for my vertical slice, and learned that I had misjudged the resolution I needed by an enormous margin. I have now spent over 200 work hours on it, and it is not finished, as you can see my work continuing on in this video. In addition to this, I was confident it would take roughly a year to do all the 3D assets and animations, using a few tricks and sticking with low-poly models. After building up a few years of Rust and having to shift from Maya to Blender, I've experimented a bit and realized that estimation is completely out the window. I am now using the incredibly unreliable, I'll deal with it once I get there strategy to plan a new time frame of probably a few years? Hopefully I can come up with a way to expedite the workflow. This point doesn't just apply to art. With a passion for becoming a game developer, a solid understanding of C Basic, and having made several experimental prototypes, I was under the woefully incorrect assumption that I could completely finish my strategy game in 3 to 4 years. The prototype alone took a bit under 2 years, and was buggy, incredibly ugly, and hacked together to the point the code was unusable for the final project. Luckily, I did learn a lot. Never update Unity or any other third-party toolset mid-project. I had known this would cause some problems, but I didn't realize how major they would be. Any and all development software can make changes between updates that break your project in ways you didn't expect. For me, there was a complete compatibility breakdown, and all I could save were my C# scripts. Everything else was lost. It wasn't my choice, as my computer died and I wasn't able to continue using the Unity 2017 install I had started the final project in. Luckily, I keep flash drive backups, but unfortunately it had not occurred to me that I needed to back up the Unity program in addition to my files. To make these last points clearly, I need to cover the full duration of my game development journey thus far, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. The world doesn't wait. I fell in love with a little PlayStation title called Brigandine: Legend of Forcina when I was younger. It came out in 1998. I always hoped there would be a sequel and dreamed of what it could be like. A remake called Grand Edition was released in Japan, but never officially reached the West. After that, there was only silence from the devs. I saw 2 separate Kickstarters for spiritual successors to Brigandine. Kingsgate literally used Brigandine's PlayStation cover art and a hastily thrown together project in 2016 with a goal of $15,000. 35 people pledged over $3,000 despite the entire project looking incredibly sus, with only the new game's amateur Photoshop logo and black text on white. For those of you who don't know, the person behind a Kickstarter gets nothing unless the campaign succeeds. The same person immediately tried again the next month, this time with a goal of $3,000, and, what a surprise, it succeeded. I kept an eye on it, and sure enough, the guy ghosted, because it was either a scam, or he was an idiot who really thought he could make Brigandine on his own for $3,000, then had the nerve to give up with other people's money in hand and not refund any of it. Yeah, it was probably a scam. Another Kickstarter project called Compendium of War actually put effort into their page, including some sort of demo. It was successfully funded with $5,000 the month after Kingsgate's second campaign succeeded. I refused to back because A, it costs more than $5,000 to make a game unless you want to dedicate years to it as a side gig or starve to death, and B, I literally just watched a guy run with $3,000 the month before and was extremely skeptical. Despite the demo, I'm unsure if anything ever came of it. My guess, based on the comments, is that it was either a scam or very unrealistic expectations. So, my initial motivation and ambition in a nutshell. I was salty that people were using one of my favorite games for financial gain, with scams or little more than good intentions. I decided I would just make my own spiritual successor, and even if only those 58 backers from Kingsgate, 52 backers from Compendium of War, and I ever played it, I would be content. Again, this was 2016, and I anticipated having it finished in a few years at most. I decided I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up in case I failed, so I started work in silence and have not stopped since. Progress has been much slower, and the time investment has been much higher than I had anticipated. Then, in 2019, Brigandine: Legend of Runersia was announced, and I was simultaneously thrilled and depressed. I was 3 years deep, and I'm stubborn, so I convinced myself to keep working on my game. My reasoning was that Runersia was a Nintendo Switch exclusive and I don't own one, so at least people like me would be able to play my spiritual successor on PC. Plus, at this point, I had already developed the vast majority of systems for the game. I redoubled my efforts and increased the bar of good enough TM, with the knowledge that the comparison would now be between my game and a modern title instead of just a PlayStation 1 title. I threw out all of the assets that were completely inadequate compared to a modern game and pressed on. That brings us to the point that I acknowledge but ignore. Be aware of the sunk cost fallacy. Brigandine: Legend of Runersia is coming to Steam 10 days after I post this video. I'm 6 years in on my game. I refuse to quit, in part because, again, I'm stubborn. But everything is harder now. I'm constantly fighting the urge to scrap my game and start a new project entirely. Everything I do, I can't help but compare to the game that I never thought would come, and despair that a solo dev will never be able to come remotely close to meeting that level of quality. I am constantly hounded by self-doubt, and quitting is always the easiest option. The sunk cost fallacy applies because I have invested so heavily into this game. I acknowledge the fallacy, but continue anyway, because I think my motivation and passion would crumble if I threw it all out and started on a new project now. The best option would be, likely, to do a hard pivot and develop a different strategy game. But I foolishly built the systems and the code framework before the visuals, so I would essentially be throwing out all of my work, even if I just make a different type of strategy game. Also, you may notice a trend. I'm stubborn. I've opted for the next best option of working on visuals that could either be used for my game as it currently exists, or for a complete redesign into a different strategy game. Hopefully, I'll be finished with the world map soon, and can start with the 3D models for the units, affording me a better estimate of how long I will be working on the rest of the project. Of course, Legend of Runetercia may never get a sequel other than the one I'm working on. It did take 20 years for the first Brigandine sequel, so unless I'm woefully underestimating how long I have left, maybe I'll be fine. My suggestion to you is to just not put yourself in this situation. If you're a solo, part-time dev, work on something novel and small. The odds of someone else making the same small, novel thing by the time it is finished is much lower than the odds of a game IP from 2 decades ago being revived by the time you spend a decade or more making your spiritual successor. And finally, I have saved what I believe is the most important failure for last. Maintain a healthy work-life balance. After years of constant work and developing a much better understanding of exactly how long I have left in the project, I started to burn out pretty hard. I was so exhausted from the constant crunch, but I had developed this unhealthy mindset in regard to working on my game that I couldn't relax and enjoy anything else because I always felt that I was wasting any free time if it wasn't being spent on my game. I refused to let my mental health get in the way of my project while, again, burning out with this unhealthy mindset. I was finally able to convince myself that creating a YouTube channel was an effort to create a revenue stream so that I could become a full-time game dev. Yes, that's right. I had to convince myself that playing games was work, and that in the long run it would contribute to financial stability that would allow me to work on my game and future games even more. I still have roughly the same mindset, but at least I'm aware of it now. That's progress, I guess. I share all of this to underline my point. Do not make your game development dreams the only aspect of your life that you put any effort into. Working every waking hour is no way to live, especially for any prolonged period. So ensure that you fit relaxation and some degree of social interactions into your schedule. In closing, I have learned from these failures, or at least most of them, but will surely have more along the way. New logs will be released every month until I finish my first game at the very least. It may be a long ride, but for the last time, I'm stubborn. So I'm in it for as long as it takes. If you're interested at all in following the development, I invite you to join the rest of my journey in this devlog series. For now, that concludes this month's devlog, so until next time, have a good one.